You've heard the claim that Genesis copied the Enuma Elish, or that Gilgamesh is the original flood story. Scholars, skeptics, and influencers all repeat the same claim, that the Bible borrowed from ancient pagan myths. But what if that's not the full story? What if even Yale professors are ignoring evidence? Today, we put the strongest version of that claim under a microscope: linguistics, flood myths, manuscript history, theology, and global traditions. From Yale lectures to cuneiform tablets, we're tearing it apart to ask the real question: did Genesis copy myths or preserve something older? Welcome to Musings and Mysteries in the Mythical Matrix. Ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, interdimensional philosophers, seekers of truth, comparative mythology enthusiasts, and last but certainly not least, all of you that desperately cling to your confirmation bias. Whether your interest is Atlantis, Zeus, or anything in between, we tackle it all from our quantumly entangled castle tucked away in the ancient flood-battered Central Pangaean mountain range. We're the one-stop shop for mystery, history, and comparative mythology. We're a podcast dedicated to exploring the ancient, mysterious, and unknown with logic and reason, and where we also theorize the fourth dimension exists and is the spiritual. Only trigger warning for this episode is a logical conversation, so if applying the Socratic method on fringe topics and the academic system is disturbing to you, you'll want to turn off the podcast now. I will also remind you that if you do enjoy our content, our myth retellings, breakdowns, debunks, be sure to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And I will also put an announcement. We have a Discord channel that is now open to the public. I will put the invite link in the show notes or description for those that are interested, for those determined seekers of truth out there that are wanting to join the Phoenix Force.
Join us.
Imagine what we can create. All right, Psych fact to our resident psychologist in training.
Hi. So, random fact, when you take a certain colored pill, the color of the pill can influence the effects. I'm so like out of it.
You're fried from school.
I'm working on 2 papers right now simultaneously, so
yeah,
I'll get there. Yeah, so people associate certain colors with specific effects. So say you take a red pill, red is associated with like stimulants, but if you take a blue pill, blue is associated with more like calming effects. So think about the Matrix.
Yeah, I was just about to say, this puts a whole new spin on the Keanu Reeves Matrix.
Yes.
In terms of how we think about our mythical Matrix.
Yes.
Should you take the blue pill or the red pill? That is the question.
I take both just to see what would happen.
Oh boy!
Don't take random pills.
Yeah,
by the way.
don't do drugs. Stay in school.
But it's not just these colors; it's other colors too. It's color psychology, and if you ever watch commercials, they use a lot of this. Like think of like an OxyClean commercial, which we're not sponsored by OxyClean, but you know
we're not. Darn, I was hopeful.
OxyClean. But yeah, the commercial, they use a lot of white, but white could symbolize purity or freshness. So that's why they use that color a lot in their commercial, or like any laundry commercial, pretty much.
No, it makes sense because you correlate like certain things to other things, that's kind of like how you build a hierarchy of understanding almost.
Yeah.
So, no, I get that. Anything else?
No.
All right. So
I mean, there's other colors, obviously, but
well, yeah. No, I was just
if people are interested, they could look it up.
Yeah, or we could do a psychology episode because we have your psych series coming up soon.
Yes.
So, all right.
Very excited.
Yes, good. I'm excited for a break so I can focus a little more on research. All right, episode overview time. So, what we're going to be doing this episode is we are going to be breaking down this copycat myth theory and really dissecting it deep. I think diving into the subject a lot more than I've seen discussed in a lot of spheres. I've seen some people try to get in depth on this, and they don't fare very well. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the general stage for the copycat myth claim, talking about what even a Yale professor says to, the more fringe things that some people say. And then we're going to do the Enuma Elish versus Genesis. We're going to take Yale's strongest parallels, and we're going to explore those. I've already done a short video breaking these parallels down, but we're going to kind of expand it a tiny bit here. And then we're going to talk about the myth of Adapa, trade and transmission theories as well. And then we're going to talk about how do we distinguish myth from history in light of everything that we're going to talk about in the previous sections. Then we're going to do summary, recap, and then maybe some musing closeouts. Not sure. I spent half an hour trying to get the sound system to function. There was a random buzzing, and it was driving me crazy on your mic. And I finally pinpointed it and got it like decent. So that kind of killed a little record time. So we'll see if we get to all of the musing recaps. It might be for one of your psych episodes at this rate. But I did have a question I was wanting to get to at some point here soon.
All right.
Okay, so we are going to roll into section 1 of this here, where we're going to be setting the stage for the myth copycat claim. So Genesis is often claimed to be a copy or adaptation of older Mesopotamian myths. This is nothing new. We've talked about this before on the show. But for those of you tuning in the first time, it's everywhere. It's anyone from Billy Carson to Yale professor. They argue Genesis is borrowing from stories like the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis epic, the tale of Adapa, all of these other mythology accounts. And in this episode, we're going to be taking these and we're going to be testing the strongest academic version of these arguments, at least that I've seen. And we are going to see if these parallels are actually indeed parallels or if it's just cherry picking the facts.
Which a lot of people like to do.
Yes, indeed. I guess I owe a little bit of a comment to the Sitchin stuff as well, because I did talk about it. I haven't done as much rehashing of all of that because I just don't like to mentally abuse my brain like that. But I do need to kind of rehash a little bit of his stuff just to make sure I have all my details right. But one thing that stood out to me is I'm pretty sure at one point he misused Enki and Ea, which they're interchangeable. But the thing is, if you're a Sumerian scholar, cuneiform scholar, they're not.
Yeah.
And this is one thing that really stood out to me from his work, where he was arguing, he made a passing comment about Ea, and it's like, well, Ea is the Akkadian name for Enki. It's not the Sumerian name. So if you're writing a book about a perspective prehistory from the gods' perspective, you would never use Ea if you actually knew in depth what you were talking about.
I think I remember you telling me about a continuity error.
Yeah.
So that might have been it.
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, no, that really stood out to me as like, yeah, it doesn't seem like Sitchin so much knows what he's talking about here. He also just invented a character that never existed in Mesopotamian literature, as far as I've been able to find between my own research and digging further into like other people's comments like on it. Like he names this scholar, it's like Endabar or something like that, and it's a person that's just not named and non-existent, and he cites it as being, I think, like maybe like the son of Adapa or some other key figure, and there's zero record of this person.
And again, this is the book that doesn't have like any sources or anything.
Nope, not a
cite.
thing.
Yeah.
Not a thing. I mean, he understood his myths. He knew the
Yeah.
Mesopotamian
Yeah.
myths, but I don't think he understood it as well. Like, he knew enough to be dangerous. It's like that saying, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. He very much
Yeah.
had a surface level knowledge of the subject. And that was the vibe I got reading it. And what frustrates me is that these topics are actually interesting enough. You don't have to fabricate anything wild for them to be really cool.
Mhm.
Like, I just discovered something like 10 minutes ago that I'm going to dig into later in the show that actually like freaking blew my mind that I didn't even know about. But apparently, I'll just tease a little bit here. Apparently, there's there's hints and rumors of a culture that predates the Sumerians. And I dug into that a little bit just out of pure curiosity. I'm like, oh, there won't be much here about this, but apparently the culture has like a whole name and everything.
Surprise.
Yeah, so that one threw me for a loop. So I'll probably go down that rabbit hole at some point in the near future. But no, so one thing, I've been listening to the Yale's free lectures they have on like religion, specifically analyzing like Christianity and the Bible versus like Mesopotamian religions of the region. And so that's kind of where I'm going to be drawing a lot of my arguments and comments from. But one thing that really stood out to me was that Christine Hayes basically said that, like in the beginning of her series, 'cause she's the Yale professor, she said, these sources contradict each other. We don't have to worry about reconciling it, just kind of like study it as a book. Like, you don't have to like just leave the contradictions be, accept that there are contradictions. And I was just like listening to this and I was thinking about it and I'm like, this is a bias. Like you've pre-decided there are contradictions in this account and you're talking about it that way. It's like you've pre-decided that there's contradictions here and you just that's it. Instead of like, hey, maybe there are contradictions, but can we reconcile them? Because there are a lot of contradictions. I think she cited some even that I've already like addressed that aren't full contradictions. Like the one that stands out that a lot of people like to cite is the plant's order of creation in Genesis 2 and how what is cited in Genesis 2 from the Hebrew implies more of a tilled and like tamed plant rather than just plants in general being created. And if you read the broader context, that's what it's saying. And so there's a lot of different nuances like that where she's kind of automatically deciding, oh, well, these just contradict each other and it's okay. And it's like, well, not necessarily. You're assuming they contradict each other. Maybe she's done more research outside of the lectures, but to just say that and to tell her students to think linearly like that, it's like, well, what if they don't? Like, why would you propose something so close-minded to the whole dynamic perspective when there are plenty of arguments to how these texts don't necessarily contradict each other and in fact they can be synergized? Yeah, I don't know. So that one that one really rattled my cage a bit. I feel like it was a little bit disingenuous to do. And like, I think the academic system has its time and place and it's appropriate, but I think as we're going to unravel in this episode here, it's not infallible, and I think common people should question it, but have the knowledge to also question it and do the research to question, not just question it just because, but go out and educate themselves, learn about these things, and not just trust the quote-unquote experts, but to actually dig into it themselves and see if what the experts say is true.
Yeah.
And that involves work, and not a lot of people. I think a lot of people listening here are seekers of truth, and they're fine doing their own work. But there are also a lot of people out there that just like the easy way out. Oh, the experts say it, so it's true, and that's it. And it's sometimes you can do that, and you have to do that to function some in society. But yeah, I think there's a balance. Anyway, let's just do a break because we are hitting the next section here, and that ran a little longer than I was expecting. So next up, we're going to be talking about the Enuma Elish versus Genesis, and I'm going to be outlining Christine Hayes' 4 strongest I think 4, 3 or 4. Something in there. So some of her strongest parallels are going to be outlined in this upcoming segment. Yes, a collection, a few. More than a couple, but less than 5. We'll be right back. It is indeed 4, but I'm also pulling an argument from Billy Carson here on Musings on Mysteries in the Mythical Matrix. We can never let the Billy Carson topic go. I respect him as a human being, but I don't respect his ability to do good research. It's pretty lacking from my observations. So, but you'll see why here in a second if you stay with me here. All right, so let's start breaking this down here. So Christine Hayes in her lecture, and I will put the link to this lecture in the show notes if you want to go listen to it yourself, just so you have a broad understanding of how exactly, like where I'm getting this from and how exactly I'm approaching it as the listener. So her first argument that she uses, no, she's not saying that these were exact copies of each other, but she draws parallels. So I want to be careful not to misrepresent what she was doing. It did seem like she was kind of towing the line towards leaning like this copied from the Enuma Elish, but she didn't really so much quite say that. But maybe it was just kind of that I'm so passionate about the subject, but it seemed like she was kind of alluding to that.
Like implying that.
To a degree, maybe.
Yeah.
But you as a listener, if you want to go listen to a 45-minute lecture from Yale on the subject, you can go listen and then come back and hear, my debunk of it.
Yeah.
All right. So first thing that she says is she brings up the temporal clause argument. So a temporal clause is pretty much setting the stage, if you will. That's the best way to describe it. There might be a better technical definition on Google if you want to see what temporal clauses technically are. But so like the Enuma Elish literally just means when on high. And that is how the text starts. And that is a temporal clause. It literally starts, when on high, these things happened. And she argues that Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, can be better translated as when God began to create, that it starts as a temporal clause as well. And so these two things seem to indicate that there are similarities in the texts here. So the response to this is that there's temporal clauses everywhere. Once upon a time, a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, like all of these are temporal clauses. They might be phrased slightly differently, but you start with a temporal clause. And I think this was written in, the Enuma Elish was written in Akkadian, which is a Semitic language as well. So across similar Semitic languages to have the same vague temporal clause phraseology that can be translated to when God began to create or when on high. That's not a stretch by any means. It just means that the locals in that Semitic region had a similar format for how they would sit down and tell a story.
Yeah.
Because I could sit down and tell a story of once upon a time and make up this really elaborate story involving myself, but that doesn't mean there's any connection to like the story of Snow White or Red Riding Hood from, the Grimm brothers or anything like that. If they even technically start with that in the Grimm brothers, I don't remember. Anyway, but
I don't know about that one.
Yeah, my point still stands though.
Yeah, it does.
Temporal clause doesn't mean that Genesis is taking and reframing a myth. It's just a way to phrase a story. And I mean, even the Popol Vuh has a variant of like a temporal clause that it uses. And so temporal clauses are everywhere. And just because we translate like one or two letters as the same for the beginning of both doesn't mean that one copied the other or that they're even related to each other.
This kind of reminds me of what I had said earlier in, I think, a previous episode at some point. I don't know. But where it's just, that's just how people talked.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
That's just how people, like I had said about like the storytelling. They were very poetic with it. It's kind of the same thing. That's just how they wrote and how they talked.
Right. Yeah, and I just looked it up, double check. Yeah, the Enuma Elish was indeed written in Akkadian, which is also a Semitic language, and so it's from the same family as the Hebrew language. So of course there's going to be some similarities. Like there's similarities in English to German, like like a lot of the D's. I'm trying to think of a good example because it's been a while since I've talked German, but like there's a lot of
spoke. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. That's fair.
It's been a while since you spoke German.
Yeah, but But I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but I know that there were certain things I remember learning about where there were similarities in like the D and the TH sound. Like the Germans would use a D and we would use a TH sound, and the words were very similar if you just swapped those two things out.
Mm-hmm.
Like if there was like a dare and you swiped it to like a TH, like I know that's not a good example because that wouldn't be a literal one, but
Yeah.
I know there's examples like that in German. They do exist, trust me. But go fact check me.
Sounds like a borderline fallacy. Trust me, I know what I'm talking about.
Sounds like a Billy Carson claim. Anyway, I need to give the guy a break. He's been thoroughly debunked. I mean him no personal disrespect, but I
honestly feel kind of bad for him.
Yeah,
but kind of don't.
Yeah. So, but like Genesis shares the stage, not the script. With the Enuma Elish. And I think that's an important distinction to keep in mind here, is that we are talking about two very different myths, as we're going to dive into. The next claim that Christine Hayes tries to draw is that she argues that ruach, which means spirit in Hebrew, that in early accounts of Genesis, it didn't mean spirit, that it means wind. And ruach has double meaning. It can mean wind or spirit. So this is a fair point to discuss. And then she contrasts this to the winds of Marduk, going back to our Enuma Elish episode on episode 35. Yeah, 35. Talking about how Marduk used his winds to trap Tiamat. And so she draws this parallel, which I thought was an interesting parallel. But then I was thinking about her claim, and I'm like, this doesn't hold water, because the book of Job is decided, there's general scholarly consensus that the book of Job is the oldest book in the Bible. Mm-hmm. And there are very clear uses of the word ruach as spirit and not as wind. And you can delineate that from the context. I mean, you can even go yourself as the listener, and you could look up on BibleHub.com. I'll rattle off 4 verses here really slow. There were more, but these were the 4 that stood out to me the most. Job 6:4, Job 7:11, Job 23, and 34:14.
I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
So, I know there's a lot of cultures, like indigenous cultures, that would define wind as a spirit. So are you sure this is like 2 separate things, or?
Well, this is Christine Hayes' argument.
Okay.
And I would agree with you, because we also see, as we've talked about with Lilith in Mesopotamian culture, the Lilith and Lilu are correlated to being spirits and being windstorm spirits. So even in Mesopotamia, you literally set me up for my next point. Thank you for that. That was perfect. No, don't apologize. That was perfect.
Oh.
But like you literally teed me up. It's like we have a precedent of the Lilitu spirit being mentioned in Enkidu's Descent to the Underworld, which is a very early text of Gilgamesh that we have a copy of. And so this literally exists early on in the Mesopotamian culture and mindset, is to correlate these two. So to make an argument that ruach only means wind and not spirit, and that they copy from the Enuma Elish, completely ignores that even the Mesopotamians had an understanding and distinction of the two, not to mention that the Bible has an older book than Genesis that has a distinction between the two.
It almost comes off as not only misleading, but kind of, I don't know a better way to word this, half-butted.
Yes.
Research.
It's very half-butted, and it feels very disingenuous, because a lot of people going into a lecture like that at Yale are not going to know better about Job being the oldest book in the Bible. And that was actually something Levi had mentioned we had on a couple episodes back. Him and I had talked about that off air, and he had mentioned about that. And I'm like, okay, so what have you learned? And he said that they think it's the oldest because of like the linguistic style used, that it's a more archaic form of Hebrew than a lot of the others. So this is widely accepted in like academic scholarship. There may be some debate around it, I don't know, but this was always my understanding, and he affirmed it from his theology studies.
Right.
So I mean, it's almost deceptive. Like it's disingenuous.
It's not almost. It kind of is. Like, I guess deceptive would imply that it's on purpose. So I guess I won't say it's deceptive, but it is very misleading for listeners to be told that.
Yes. Exactly. And that's like my issue with this here, is you're presenting this as fact and not even addressing the other end of it. She's literally just presenting her side and not the other spectrum here. Whereas I literally went dug up this Yale lecture that disagreed with everything I've laid out, and it was a little painful to listen to and to hear these parallels that I had like kind of like missed because of just not being super familiar with like the deep semantic aspects and all of that we're about to get into. But it's like, you know what, I want to hear this and I want to see maybe I'm wrong on something, and I dug into it more. And it's like, no, I'm very much not wrong on this.
With any debate, you have to be able to listen to the other side and be willing to listen to the other side to be able to present your own side effectively.
Yes, but an academic institution like Yale should be able to put forward the side that also disagrees with their side, especially when the evidence is very inconclusive, and showing just a very limited scope of evidence that supports your side and ignoring the evidence that doesn't. That seems a bit disingenuous to me.
Like, I'm not going to say where I went for my bachelor's, but I would expect that from my bachelor's, not Yale. I would expect that from the school that I went for my bachelor's, not Yale.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, for everyone else, I'm not smart enough to go to Yale.
You're smarter than you give yourself credit for. All right, so the third one here, and this is the last one from Christine Hayes specifically from her lecture. She draws a connection to tehom and the name Tiamat. So tehom is the Hebrew word to describe the deep in Genesis 1:2 when you read, I'm trying to do it from memory here. Now the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of... Now, I butchered it. I'm just going to keep going. It's fine.
What do you need me to look up?
Let me try it again. I'm just going to do it from verse 1. Because I was trying to start it in the middle of verse 2. I was like, yeah, no, good luck with that.
Go for it.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. I put emphasis there. So let's remember this here for a second, because there's three things to take away from this. Darkness, deep, waters. There's three different things mentioned in this verse here. And so again, we're going to see how Professor Hayes is cherry-picking evidence in just a second. So her argument is that tehom sounds like Tiamat, and it's supposed to be linguistically related to the Akkadian word Tiamat, because Tiamat is a name in Akkadian.
Right.
That it's linguistically related to Tiamat, which I'm learning cuneiform Sumerian. I'm not learning cuneiform Akkadian. It kind of goes hand in hand a little bit, but I haven't gone down that rabbit hole yet, so I can't speak to that. It may be, it may not be. I don't know. But so she argues that tehom, in the original Hebrew, it lacks a ha, which ha is their definitive article. It's their the in Hebrew. So like we've talked about before on the show, ha mayim. So it lacks a ha tehom. It's just tehom. It's not ha tehom. So she argues that this means it could. She doesn't say it is, but she argues that it could be a name and not just like describing something. And so it could then in theory be related to Tiamat. And it might be referring to Tiamat, because then, building off of her previous argument we just debunked, the ruach was over the tehom. So the wind was over Tiamat. And she's drawing this parallel, which sounds really cool until we dig into it a bit further.
Sounds like a big stretch.
It's
big one.
Academic yoga going on here.
Yeah, my back is hurting from that one.
All right, so... Okay, so an important distinction to make here is in that Hebrew, tehom is never personified. Tiamat specifically has agency in his slang, and it's pretty much always, from my understanding, used to specifically delineate Tiamat, the deity, in the Enuma Elish. It is not like tehom, which is used to describe the deep. So, for example, in Genesis 7:11, it talks about how the fountains of the great deep burst forth. That's tehom, deep. It's the same word. So we have this connection here of usage. But here's where she's cherry pegging. She takes the whole verse. So now the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Genesis 1:2. She ignores darkness. Hoshek does not have a ha in front of it either. It does not have a definitive article. And so she cherry picks tehom, lacking a definitive article, and ignores hoshek. But if tehom is a name, hoshek, which is literally just a couple words in front of tehom, would also have to be a name.
Girl, what are you doing?
Yeah. And then continuing.
There's more.
Oh, there's more. There's more. So we go down. I think it's in Genesis. I think it's even in Genesis 1 too, but it definitely appears in Genesis 1:6. We have a ha-mayim referring back to and describing this deep. So again, the waters. So this deep is again delineated in the text as showing tehom is just water. It's not a deity. Even Strong's interlinear concordance makes note of this, that primordial water deities were common in like other cultures surrounding it, but that tehom was never personified. And so she makes this stretch that, anywhere from Strong's concordance to anyone that looks at the full linguistic understanding of Hebrew and breaks it down can very clearly understand that tehom is not a deity. It's just a voidless deep.
A thing.
In fact, I'd actually go a step further. So going back to the Enuma Elish again, we have two primordial deities, Tiamat and Apsu. Apsu was the freshwater deity. Tiamat was the saltwater deity. Tehom more relates to Apsu in description, not Tiamat. Apsu is used. In fact, I kept reading this over and over again in all the Mesopotamian myths from Jeremy Black. It kept referring to the Apsu, and Stephanie Dawley's too. It kept saying about like Apsu, but it was a description of something. It was a description of the deep, like a deep part of the ocean or a deep part of darkness or something, if you will. It was describing these features unpersonified as just a force of nature, when Apsu originally was a deity. And so this is kind of where tehom much more matches Apsu in description as being just this force rather than like some deity here. If we were to compare the two by definition, Tiamat doesn't ever get used this way that Apsu does, but Apsu, at least as far as I'm aware, Apsu gets used this way to describe this just deep that exists. And tehom gets used this way, but Tiamat does not. Tiamat is a name. And so she's very much convoluting concepts where there are, if we were to translate tehom, we would probably translate it as Apsu, not as Tiamat. In fact, we definitely would, because the meanings match up. And so, Tiamat is a goddess. Tehom is just a puddle. And to conflate these two concepts together is mind-bending to me.
She's just a puddle.
We're gonna go a little bit further here. We're gonna try to blitz through this last one, and then we'll take a break.
Reminds me of the Olaf song. I'd be a happy snowman.
Stares at the puddle and contemplates for a minute. Oh man, no, it's true though. All right, so then we have separating the waters, the classic Billy Carson one, where Wes Huff stitched it and then did the where is it? Yeah, when he asked for what are the parallels, and that was the only one that Billy could come up with. And this, by the way, this lecture from Yale is free online. Like anyone can go listen to it.
There's a reason why it's free.
Well, yes, but like Billy Carson could have gone and listened to it, and like
Yeah.
I'd actually have had a little bit of respect for Billy if he like actually knew all these off the top of his head and he had rattled them off to Westhoff. I'd be like, okay, you're still wrong, but like you at least took the time to go and listen and do some research.
You're educated in your wrongness, but
we need to get that on a T-shirt and sell that.
You're educated in your wrongness.
Yes. Oh man, my local Socratic circle does not support you. All right, but yeah. So this is the last claim here that really parallels Genesis 1 and 2. Excuse me. Jeez. That parallels Genesis 1 and 2 in the Enuma Elish is that God separates the waters above from the waters below to create, and we also see this in the Enuma Elish. And so you have this copying of cosmic water splitting. But again, we have major differences. The Enuma Elish, it's violent and it's a dismemberment of Tiamat. Genesis is a very peaceful verbal command where God is bringing order from chaos. And in fact, the Popol Vuh, which is the Mayan creation story, in the first couple lines starts out with a primordial water that then gets split when the mountains emerge from the ocean. And then it gets split when like rivers form and everything. So it's not a unique idea to Mesopotamia. It's a very common thing. In fact, it's my understanding there's actually a lot of various mythological cultures out there that have this, but Mayan was one that was very readily available. And so if we're going to argue that separating the waters is a parallel that we can draw to say that these borrowed from each other or that one borrowed from the other, we are then faced with the question of transatlantic contact, I think, where I don't think it's so much as separating the waters above from below, but we have a separation of waters splitting from side to side. And so it's a similar idea that exists. And so I think this speaks more, again, to an myth that existed pre, people going over to the Americas. So, but yeah, it's shared imagery. It's not evidence of a shared, copycat myth. It's copying an original myth that existed. Because how else do you explain something like that unless you want to argue transatlantic contact, and then you're going down a whole nother rabbit hole that academia won't touch either. So it's you don't really
reason why they won't touch that.
You don't have many options. But yeah, and then one other thing that stood out to me that I'm going to hit real quick here is what about the extra details that aren't featured in other myths, specifically looking at Genesis versus the Enuma Elish. So for example, there are 4 rivers listed. It's the Tigris, the Euphrates, and then there's Pihon and Gishon, I think. I might be mixing those up slightly, but there are 2 other river names that are listed in relation to the Garden of Eden. They should be in Genesis too, because I see you going to fact check me. No, I actually have them right here in my notes. It's Gihon and Pishon. I think, yeah. Okay. I got them in my notes, so we're good.
Stop second guessing yourself.
Well, I guessed.
No, stop it.
I guessed, and then I looked, and I'm like, oh, wait, it's in my notes. But yeah, so we have a myth with Enki, and it talks about Enki creating the Tigris and the Euphrates. It's actually kind of graphic in a sexual way. I'll leave it at that because I didn't put any trigger warnings, but it's classic for Mesopotamian motifs.
It wouldn't be Mesopotamian.
Mesopotamian. I know talk good.
Sorry.
Anyway,
we're chaotic this one.
Yes, we are. It was the whole technical issue thing that definitely derailed me.
It did.
But why include 2 rivers that we aren't even sure of the location today that aren't mentioned in any Mesopotamian myth if we're making a myth copied off of Mesopotamian tales? Why include Gihon and Pishon in the creation account with Eden? It doesn't fit. It doesn't make sense with the motif. And so I think that this speaks to something much deeper going on that a lot of academics really just want to overlook. And I feel like it kind of does stem from a confirmation bias, if you will. But what do you think? Because I just laid out a good long line of reasoning here.
Yeah, I agree that it just seems like confirmation bias, especially the Yale professor. I forget her name. Yeah,
Professor Christine Hayes. No disrespect meant in terms of personal attack, but it does... It's frustrating to see a professor of Yale present such a poor argument that is so easy to debunk if you go do your own research. And that's just kind of was frustrating to me. Mm-hmm. All right, so yeah, we'll take a break here and we will be right back.
Hey, y'all. Bet you were expecting Jay to bring you back.
Yeah, I kind of panicked because I looked down and I'm like, oh shoot, the song's about to end and start over again. We got to come back. So
I came in clutch.
Yeah, you really helped out there. Thank you. I was busy trying to take note of the timestamp. I might just have you do that, actually bring us back, and then we can just focus on writing for a second. It might be the new trend. Anyway.
Okay, get ready for some random comments then. If you're gonna surprise me and bring me back.
You kidding me? I do random comments all the time when I bring us back. So.
What podcast episode was it that you put in a surprise at the end?
Oh, I did that for a couple. I think that was we did that with Karen's interview at the very end, and I think there was one before. It was one of the ones before that. right before or like 2 before?
You shouldn't have mentioned which ones because then they would have had to listen to all of the episodes to
Oh, yeah,
find
that's
it.
true. Free view hours on YouTube. Whoops. All right. Well, I just forfeited it. There you go. All right. Yeah, you could still be a good sport and go listen to all the episodes anyway if you haven't. All right. So section 3 here, we're going to talk about Adapa, trade and transmission theory. So we're going to dive into this here a little bit because this was an interesting point that I wanted to discuss because it did seem a little bit counter to my myth copycat point, an argument that I've done. And so I wanted to bring up a counter to my side and explore it a little bit, like Professor Hayes should have done with her. Anyway, I'll let it go. All right. I do think I had this correction down from a while back, and then like we jumped around in our episodes. But I think I had mentioned in a previous episode that Gilgamesh had evolved quite a bit in the myth story. It does seem like there was a little bit of evolution in the tale, but with different versions at the very least. But it wasn't as much as I expected when I really dug deeper into it. It didn't seem like there was extreme substantial changes. It seemed like maybe the story was just kind of more fragmented into poems and then got synergized together into a streamlined account rather than like drastically different versions of it. So I did just want to clarify that for any of our listeners out there from previous episodes. Okay. So about evidence for trade and transmission theory, and that this was a counter to my point, so I wanted to bring this up. There is evidence of certain fragments of Adapa and Gilgamesh being found at Tel El Armana, which is in Egypt. So we have evidence that there was trade that would have happened between the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians. So I wanted to note this because this is a fair counter to the, well, maybe these myths did copy. I think we've very much debunked it as a whole because if all you really have to grab onto at this point is when on high and when God began to create, separating the waters from their waters, which the Mayans have, and then a serpent stealing the gift of life from eternal life from Gilgamesh after he retrieved it from under the ocean to the tree of the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. Mm-hmm. If those are the only parallels you have, I feel like there's really not much grounds to argue myth stealing anyway. But it's still a point that I wanted to explore, even though I feel like I've kind of already just debunked it.
Did you mention like the general ballpark year that this was put on Yale's website?
That was a lecture from, I look like the 90s from the camera quality. I'll just put it there.
So it's been a while. So there may be more like information, but I think we were talking about this before the podcast, I think a couple days ago actually, but where we made the point that, if it was debunked, Yale probably would have taken it down.
Yeah, they wouldn't leave it up.
So they probably still agree with what's being said in the video if they kept it on their website this entire time.
Yeah, and this is why I have a distrust towards some academics and like academia in general, is because this kind of disinformation and poor methodology, gets put out there and it gets taught. And it's like, if you actually dig into everything that's here, it doesn't hold water. Mm-hmm. And hey, if there's an argument that I missed or there's an angle I missed, email us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com. I'm not infallible, but I'm very convinced that, you can't just cherry pick and say, oh, there's no definitive article on tehom, so therefore it could be a name, and then ignore Hoshek and then Hamayim. That's just not how, that's very much cherry picking the semantics of the language.
The more I research for school or the more that we talk during the podcast and everything, the more I realize that a lot of people like to oversimplify things.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And people underestimate their ability to learn on their own. And I'm not saying you can go out and like learn to be a surgeon on your own or anything like that, because there are certain things you do just need formal training for.
Yes.
But you can certainly go out and research these own topics yourself and get good at them. Like, I don't have a degree in Assyriology. I'm not an Assyriologist, but I just picked up John Hayes' cuneiform, Sumerian cuneiform from Ur 3 period textbook that's meant to be a self-guide. And I just started working through it, and I'm starting to be able to delineate some basic signs. And like, I'm referencing all sorts of indexes and everything that we have as well. Like we have the electronic, I forget what it spells out, but it's connected to Penn University, I think. It's the EPSD. There's a cuneiform appendix on there that with like different transliterations for Sumerian and Akkadian, and then like different English ways. So I mean, it's you can learn these things on your own. It's a little harder a lot of times, but like that's the thing is like you don't have to have a degree in the subject to ask a good question about the subject that pokes a hole in an academic's opinion on the subject.
Don't be scared of hard things.
Yeah, and that's like kind of a large part of the premise here at MQuad is like we're about seeking truth, and it's like we don't have to have a degree to seek truth. We just need to have an understanding of the subject material. It shouldn't just be, oh, well, I disagree with you because you're wrong.
Well, not just an understanding, but a willingness to be wrong.
Yes. Oh, I'm willing to be wrong, yes.
And a willingness to learn from it, yeah.
Yeah, I've been wrong before on the show, and I'll be wrong again.
You've admitted being wrong before.
I just admitted here. I said something wrong about Gilgamesh that, upon further research, wasn't what I originally thought. So, if you're listening to stuff, if you're listening to this episode 49 and you see episode 150 is releasing, like, hey, there's probably been some stuff that we've corrected from the last 50 episodes. So if you've listened to 1 through 50, you probably want to keep going before you criticize, too much.
That is another thing that I've noticed too, is a lot of people are afraid of being wrong, and that keeps them from learning new things because they're scared of failing, or they're scared of just being wrong.
Yeah. So, I mean, another thing, too, is you have to understand the methodology. Like, there's a certain methodology and way of thinking to, like, academics as a whole. And in historiography, I think is what it's called, where it's like...
history of history?
Yeah, like historiography. How do you know that?
Because you mentioned this to me before.
Oh, okay.
You have to realize... I understand. I remember the most random things.
Yeah, it's like your area is usually psychology, and you're just like, oh, yeah, that's what that is. Like,
no, I just remember... No, because it sounded really weird to me.
Oh, okay, yeah.
The history of history, and then it just doesn't sound like the word that it should sound like.
Right, and so there are certain things that you just like, you might think things work one way, but they actually work differently in the actual field of study. And so this is where like I like looked at this stuff, and I dug into this a little bit. Because I'm like, okay, what evidence do we have of these texts being in Israel? So we have a tablet of Gilgamesh that was actually found in Megiddo, which is in modern-day Israel. I've been there. But it is not... It's not the fragment that has Utnapishtim or Ziuzudra on it. It's an earlier fragment. And so we don't know for sure that this was like that they even had in Israel the full tale of Gilgamesh. It might have just been this tablet. We could presume they could have, but to say that they did have Gilgamesh and that they were familiar with Gilgamesh, because we found this one little fragment of Megiddo, the Megiddo tablet, that doesn't mean that they knew it for sure. And I asked my dad about this too, because I'm like, hey, like, am I misunderstanding something about historiography here? Like, does this work differently? And he's like, no, we can't say something for sure if we don't have that specific evidence. And my dad, for those of you that don't know, he is kind of an expert in the archaeology field, because he did a groundbreaking archaeology discovery with World War I. But that's for another time. Go listen to episodes 19 and 20. I think we talked about it a bit on there. But so we've not found the Enuma Elish at all in Israel, and we've only found the one Megiddo fragment of Gilgamesh that does not include the flood story. So to assert that we know that the Israelites had knowledge of the Enuma Elish or Gilgamesh pre-Babylonian captivity in that region is an assumption being pushed as a fact. It defies historiography. It defies the whole historic method, in fact. We can hypothesize, that's fine, but we can't say that for sure. And
it's the scientific process, the scientific method.
Exactly. And so Christine Hayes is again wrong, because she made a statement in one of her lectures. I think it was in her third lecture on the series. But I actually dug up the transcript and found it. In some ways, the opening of Genesis 1... So I'm reading the direct quote here. In some ways, the opening of Genesis 1 seems to recall a language and themes of older Mesopotamian stories. We've talked about the Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish. The Israelites would have known this story. You cannot assume that. You don't know. Yes, maybe during and after the Babylonian captivity in around 600 BC, a little after, I think it was like 590 BC. We can assume that, I think, to some degree, but we don't know that about before. There is zero precedent to say that the Israelites knew about the Enuma Elish or Gilgamesh. We don't know that. They knew Gilgamesh from the Megiddo tablet. They knew of Gilgamesh, but they we don't know if they knew the full story or not.
Right.
So to say the Israelites would have known this story referring to the Enuma Elish is blatantly false, because I didn't even say this yet, but the closest the Enuma Elish was found in any tablets that were found to the Israelites was actually in Turkey. It was connected to the Hittite Empire. So we haven't even found anywhere near proximity to modern day Israel for the Enuma Elish. So to make a statement like this, you're assuming that Genesis was written during or after Babylonian captivity, which that's an assumption we've already addressed with my dad episodes 19 and 20. The higher criticism argument there is debunked, and it would have been probably debunked by the time Christine Hayes did this lecture as well, because I think that was like a find in the 70s or 80s by Gabriel Barkay, who found a fragment of the book of Numbers, and it was written in the priestly style, Numbers. So that indicates that these texts could have very easily existed pre-Babylonian exile. So Christine's logic on this topic is basically as follows. Premise: that Genesis was written during the exile. It's an assumption based on faulty connections to the Enuma Elish that we've already basically debunked. Premise: that Israelites encountered the Enuma Elish during captivity. It's plausible. It's in fact likely. I'd give her that, honestly. If that was the only point, I'd say she'd won this argument. And then the Genesis 1 is a literary response to the Enuma Elish, which is very speculative, and that then her conclusion is that the Bible reworks this older myth for the theological lens that the Hebrews have, which again, it's based on all of these flawed premises. I have a major issue with almost every single one of these. So yes, we have evidence that some of these myths traveled through trade, but we don't have evidence of the stories that needed to be in Israel being in Israel for this to be true. So it may, in terms of myth dissemination, it may weaken my original argument slightly, but that I've used at least in past content talking like about some of Billy Carson's stuff. But I think the point still stands, and it's just been reinforced with the stronger premise of a deeper analysis into Genesis and the Enuma Elish. I see you've got a smirk on your face. So you got something you want to share?
Not necessarily. I'm just looking up the professor. I'm trying to find out if she's still alive.
Oh, yeah.
But
okay.
I don't know if this is the same person.
Yeah, that's her.
Okay, so she's still alive. So that's.
I should have her on a debater.
Well, I don't know if this is true or not. Let me see. I saw something about she actually fairly recently just got her doctoral degree.
Interesting.
In 2022, but I saw that on one thing, so I'm not sure if that's accurate. But
well, if it's like Yale's website, I would believe that. But
yeah, I'm trying to find it. But
if it was like writemyownbio.com or something, I'd be kind of skeptical.
Yeah, but she has a lot of publications actually. So what?
Or a wiki article.
Oh my gosh! Please no. If I see anyone use Wikipedia,
it's a good hub for sources. It is not a good source.
Like I said, it's a good start.
Yes.
But you can't cite it for academic purposes.
Yeah. Okay, we're
getting off topic.
Yeah, and we're also kind of running up on time here a little bit. So even though we haven't quite flowed into the next topic yet, we are at a pause point. So I'm going to tackle some stuff after this break that still relates to this general premise of the Adapa Gilgamesh point. But we will be back shortly. Stay with us.
Hi, gentlemen and gentle ladies.
I forgot to unmute myself. Musers, mystery seekers, those of you that are dedicated to questioning the academic sphere and the biases that they hold that they won't admit that they hold.
Nerd.
I just made all that up off the top of my head. All right, so...
Did you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, I sound very eloquent when I bring us back from break, and then I just ramble into like complete nonsense like 2 seconds later, and I'm like, Anyway, so trade diffusion versus common origin. That's what I kind of want to talk about here. Well, it's not kind of what I want to talk about. It's what we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
So, all right.
Stay tuned.
Yes. Well, you're tuning in now, so your tune has stayed. All right. So if the Hebrews copied the myths of like the Enuma Elish and Gilgamesh, why are there so many drastic differences and these parallels are so weak that we see here? And looking at the Genesis flood and the Gilgamesh flood, the boat shape is apples to oranges. One is a seaworthy vessel of a 6-to-1 length to width ratio that is used by modern cargo ships. The other one's a cube. There's different flood lengths that exist. There's different reasons for the flood. You have moral corruption in Genesis, and you have noise in Atrahasis. And so Christine again makes the argument that this is to fit the moral narrative that the Bible has. But like, why would you make it something so specific as they do in the Bible? Because as we've broken down in our analysis of these early texts, the genetic corruption that we see in Genesis 6, the trail follows. You can literally follow it, as we broke down 2 episodes ago now. You can follow that from the Genesis 3 to the Genesis 6 to the Genesis 19, all the way up to the Canaanite conquest. This thread intertwines like the whole Pentateuch and even beyond. And so why would you change it and then make it so complex? If anything, this is more likely the true account, and Atrahasis is the deformed account. So it's just too complex to weave it together, I think. Widespread flood myths across supposedly 200 cultures, just from loose research again, to find a specific number. It makes this trade idea unlikely for a flood, yet scholars like Stephanie Dawley want to just dismiss this with a wave of a hand and be like, oh, it was just spread by missionaries. And it's like, okay, you're saying that about supposedly around 200 flood stories now? Really? You're just going to dismiss it with, nah, that's pretty weak. Because even if one of those fails, one of those 200 that isn't directly connected in the trade routes with the Mesopotamian Fertile Crescent, Egypt region, Greece region, even one of those is an original story, that the whole house of cards falls to the ground, because then we have precedent for these. So it doesn't even have to be all 200 are true. It could be that 5, 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 even were influenced by missionaries in some way. But even if 1 or 2 weren't, the argument still stands about this origin of a flood myth. And so, again, this is where I have a real problem with how these academics approach these issues, is because they're approaching it so much from that standard model lens, and we can't think outside of that box. And here at MQuad, it's all about thinking outside the box, where I'll even talk about things from a non-Christian perspective sometimes, because I want to think broader about these issues. So, yeah, okay. So I already hit the closest copy of the Enuma Elish. So we'll hit structural and theological divergence here next. So, I mean, Genesis is written more as a historical narrative. There are some maybe vague poetic elements to it, as you can find in like the speech and everything, but it does flow more as a historic narrative compared to something like the Psalms. So you got genealogies and chronology present in there, and you don't really have that in most of the Mesopotamian tales that we've gone through. Mesopotamian myths are very poetic and formulaic. They're repetitive. They are very hard to decipher. Even the translations are very hard to decipher through, where I almost feel like when I'm just reading the stories in English, I'm still reading a different language sometimes. And that one it's rough. but they had the Mesopotamians had no formal method of keeping history, the way that the Greeks or Romans did, at least. And this comes from John Hayes, not related to Christine Hayes, because I looked that up because I was curious. I'm like, is this her husband? No.
I wouldn't be surprised.
No, it's not. But this is the handbook for learning cuneiform I've been reading through. Is he makes this statement here. Again, we have a theological difference, and to Christine Hayes' credit, she acknowledges these differences of a theological difference of monotheism versus polytheism in Genesis versus the Enuma Elish, respectively. It involves multiple gods in the Enuma Elish and Mesopotamian myths in general, chaos, arbitrary actions, as we've seen. Looking at the cursing of a gate is a perfect example of arbitrary actions. Like there's really no whim, rhyme, or reason that's visible to the Mesopotamians. But if you look closely enough at the Bible, you can start to pick out that trend. And so if Genesis was copied, why is there such a radical difference? Like why would you not model these so much closer after like your original source? Not a lot of people could read. It'd be very easy to do if you can read and you had the motive to do this. Why would you invent a completely new story? Why not borrow the Enuma Elish almost completely? Why do we not actually see good parallels? Like the parallels that Christine Hayes draws, they're very weak, and we've debunked pretty much every single one of them academically. Why do we not actually see like good parallels out there? Like where are they? They don't exist, and that's the thing. So I mean, yeah, I don't know. Another way to look at this too is myth evolution and textual stability. So we have things like Gilgamesh did have some slightly different versions, like we've talked about. I've kind of explained that a little bit already.
Well, I think we've talked about Grimm Brothers and how the stories have changed over time, like the original Cinderella versus the Cinderella, like modern Cinderella.
Oh yeah, the
original one,
Rapunzel versus the original versus the new Rapunzel is very different too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get into it, but
yeah, go read the Grimm Brothers. It's grim. Anyway, so one that stands out to me as having a multiple different version is which we've talked about is Inanna or Ishtar's descent. So Inanna is the more original version, the older version, and then Ishtar's descent is the newer version, and it changed some details, like the beings that went down to talk to Ereshkigal, the goddess of the underworld. It was these two little beings that went down and comforted Ereshkigal in Inanna's descent, but in Ishtar's descent, same character, just different name, different language. In Ishtar's descent, it's the good looks being that goes down and tries to seduce Ereshkigal, and she curses him. And so you have these very different things that happen in these supposedly same stories. And so there was some myth evolution that existed, but we don't have evidence of this within the Bible. So, yeah, and then there's another way to look at this too. So the Bowl of Heaven, I don't think I've ever made this specific connection on air. Maybe I did a while back. But in Gilgamesh and Enkidu slay the Bowl of Heaven, right? That's the being that comes down after they insult Ishtar, Inanna. And then Inanna goes to the underworld to see Ereshkigal, and she goes in, I forget which one, but she goes in one of the stories to grieve the loss of the Bowl of Heaven. So it's interesting because it seems like a continuity error on the surface, where it's like she's like going down to grieve the Bowl of Heaven, but like it already died in Gilgamesh, and then Gilgamesh cites her betrayal of Dumuzi in Gilgamesh. And so that's, sorry, I kind of misremembered it a little bit, but that's where the plot hole is where you have Gilgamesh specifically cites Dumuzi's betrayal, or Inanna's betrayal of Dumuzi, her lover, in Gilgamesh, but that hadn't happened yet when Inanna is going down to grieve the Bowl of Heaven, Ereshkigal's husband. So you do have a potential continuity error. Now a way to resolve this continuity error, of course, is to say that the Bowl of Heaven, it's a Gugulana, is a title and not just a name. So it could refer to multiple different people. So there is a way around it. But you do have these potential continuity errors that exist in these Mesopotamian myths as well. And they are a bit more convoluted to decipher than biblical contradictions are. Thoughts? I know I've been rambling for a while.
I have none.
Okay. just blank slate, just,
It's a black void.
I need to get better at the sound pad. Just We're not saying anything bad. It's just emphasizing what's going on in our minds right now.
No, it's more like the static.
I don't think I have static.
What is it? The radio static or something. The sound the TV plays or something when it's testing.
Yeah, that's the closest I had to the static.
Broadcast
It's just
Yeah.
okay. Anyway,
I promise I'm not saying bad words.
no, we're not. We're just laughing in the background. That's all that's getting blipped out. All right.
I apologize for our chaos.
But yeah, and then you have a language barrier element to this as well, to this myth copying idea. So that even if Gilgamesh was present at Megiddo, it was Akkadian cuneiform. And so Akkadian was a trade language, yes. Cuneiform was like a written trade language, yes. But like, how do we know that the Hebrews were literate enough to read this regularly, not just to read their own language, but to understand another language, read another language, then have the motive to translate and adapt this mythological text to fit their own mythology into a complex theological narrative that has all of these weird things interwoven into it, talking about breeding of angels from heaven with humans, and that this is something that God is judging all the way from Genesis to the Canaanite conquest. Not to mention, why would you go to all of this work? If you really want to speculate this, okay, sure, maybe you can speculate it, but it lacks any form of academic evidence, textual evidence. There's just nothing here to corroborate this. And so I side with Occam's razor on this, is that the simple explanation is most likely the truth. And so it's much more likely that Genesis is part of an original stream of memory rather than copying other myths. It goes again back to that myth, or what we call the mythical matrix. So,
snap.
Have you developed any thoughts yet?
Me?
Yeah, have you developed any thoughts?
You're going to laugh, but I was just thinking about chicken nuggets.
Oh, okay. Well, we're going to have some chicken nuggets tomorrow night.
Yes, we are. I'm excited. I've been wanting that.
Man, this has been a long section.
It has.
Yeah, it's we've been on this section for 2 breaks now.
Really?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
This is just full section 3. I have one more section after this, so we won't do any other follow-ups or anything. We'll save that for like a Musings episode or something.
Wow. I think a lot of people need to just go out and search for the information themselves and come to their own conclusions. But
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, definitely listen to like experts and everything, but still find your own information.
Trust but verify here on Musings on Mysteries in the Mythical Matrix. We will return in just a moment.
If you mix mayo and barbecue, you get a really good sauce for chicken nuggets.
It's probably a little weird hearing this really epic, like ancient, like song for like, kind of Middle East themed almost, and then hearing like, yeah, here's how to make a sauce for chicken nuggies.
Chicken nuggies.
But yeah, no. So we're going to talk about preservation bias, because I think that there is a bias in how we look at these texts. Obviously, but there's still more arguments to be made for bias in how we look at these texts. So I want to put forward the premise that just because Sumerian clay tablets are older and they're the oldest records that we have, it doesn't mean they're the oldest stories. Cuneiform tablets, again, this is from John Hayes, the cuneiform textbook that I'm reading through. He said that cuneiform tablets were literally designed to outlast the burning of a city. So they were made to, maybe that was accidental, maybe it was just the materials they had because they really only had like clay for like bricks and stuff. So maybe it was a coincidence, but either way, they designed something that had the ability to outlast the pretty much anything else that exists in terms of like writing form, and versus like what the Hebrews had. They had scrolls, and those deteriorate very quickly. In fact, it's again, this is a point Levi brought up to me when we were off air, but he said it's actually very surprising. We found like the Dead Sea Scrolls and the fragment of P52. I had to look behind me because I have a replica of it. P52 and all these other fragments that we have. It's actually like very surprising we found it, because the region is so humid that like it normally would deteriorate. And so to have copies as old as we have is actually really impressive. And so then you have to wonder how much more exists, because I also have a papyrus replica from Egypt over there from when one of my family members went. And so you got to wonder, like looking at these, like, you know, from the papyrus of like, you know, of Hebrew scrolls to the papyrus of Egyptians, how much documentation of history has just been lost to natural deterioration. And the Sumerians were just smart enough and maybe just lucky enough to put their stories on clay tablets. And so they're the oldest records we have. But just because they're the oldest records we have surviving doesn't mean that they're the original or even the oldest version. Jeez, I don't know why that slipped. Not a Freudian slip. Oh, I need a sip of water. My mouth's dry. That's what it was. All right. All right.
Oh my gosh. I love it.
But no, so it's entirely possible that Hebrew or Proto-Hebrew scrolls bearing original flood memories actually existed predating these tablets that we have now, and that they're just gone, just lost due to time. And then you have other things too, like the burning of the Library of Alexandria. That's another huge one. So you've got all of these factors, and so and again, we can't argue from ignorance, and I'm not trying to argue from ignorance. I'm just trying to help expand the ways we think about this here. That we can't say for sure that these stories are older. You know, other stories besides Sumerian are older because we don't have evidence for it. But of course, we're not going to have evidence. You know, it's like the it's almost like a survivorship bias, almost. You know, where it's like you're looking at like where like a plane gets shot and you're like, oh, it has bullet holes here, but not here. So it means we need to give it armor where it has bullet holes. And then someone points out that, oh, hey, it doesn't have bullet holes here because when it gets bullet holes here, it gets shot down. So you actually need to armor up those points that don't have holes. You can look up an image of this on Google Images. It'll give you a better visual representation, but survivorship bias. And so it's almost like a form of survivorship bias here, almost, where it's just like, okay, we have the oldest we have is cuneiform Sumerian, so therefore it's the oldest. But what if it's not? And that's actually something we're going to talk about here in a little bit. So one more section. We're going to skip all of my closeout recaps and maybe just do a musing episode, because yeah. All right. So one last thing I wanted to ask. So we're going to kind of bleed into section 4 here. Is how do we decipher myth from history? What do we take seriously and what do we not take seriously then? Because we're looking at a lot of different types of tales, especially with like Adapa, Etana, Inanna, like the things we were looking at here versus things like Atrahasis in the Epic of Gilgamesh. They have a different type of flair to them. So like how do we delineate between these? Do you have any thoughts?
No.
Okay.
Was I supposed to have one?
No, I was just curious if you had something, because sometimes you'll say something really smart when I hit you with a question on the fly. So, yeah, sometimes. Sometimes I say something really dumb. You know,
Virgin.
Yeah, you know what? I'm just going to mute you. No more from you for a while. All right. But we have... I think there are ways to delineate these. We have spiritual journeys versus physical events that happen. So like Inanna's descent, Etana's ascent, I think that there is more of an element of symbology and a metaphysical aspect to this almost, where it's like you have people going to spiritual realms versus things like the Genesis flood, the Tale of Atrahasis, Epic of Gilgamesh, all of these, they have more structure, geography, dates almost around them, depending on how you're looking at it and which account. You have real world anchoring in Genesis, like Genesis 7:11. You have fountains of the deep. That whole description, I just released the video on that actually. Well, when this episode released, that'll be like 2 weeks ago. But release a short video breaking that down, what fountains of the deep are, and the potential science behind that the ancients got right. You have the arc dimensions actually working. So you have different types of myth, and each deserve different types of considerations. Like the one going back to the Atlantis dialogue, the one that they tell Solon, they clearly state it's a declination of heavenly bodies, so planets, versus like what we proposed with Ninurta and Asag, is it's a volcano, versus Gilgamesh probably just being a regular like real figure. So you have a lot of different ways to look at it. So, but yeah, scientific plausibility I think adds a lot to it, with the saltwater, freshwater way that the fish would have survived, which is the video that I released talking about. It was Memoric, I think is what it was, but it's like the layerings of how freshwater and saltwater don't always mix. They stratify. And so you have these plausible things being described in myth where it's very extreme and it seems like a stretch because we're not familiar with it. But you have to look at the details of what the myth's trying to communicate. And that's where I think things that tell you about a spiritual journey, about going to heaven or going to the underworld, there's probably, maybe not, but maybe there's more of a metaphorical element to it. And so I think that that's kind of how we delineate these myths versus history. And then understanding that the Mesopotamians didn't have a traditional form of writing history and they wrote things in myth. And so even the metaphysical is going to have some history probably embedded in it in some capacity. All right, so again, so last thing in this main point here is the Babel hypothesis. So, I mean, you have myths being dispersed from a post-Babel shared memory, and I think that that's what's going on, and that's what we're seeing here. And I think it's more consistent with the global myth parallels that we're finding rather than just random diffusion of trade. Trade doesn't explain how a similar creation account ends up with the Mayans that the Hebrews have. You can't explain that unless you want to get all fringe ancient aliens like the History Channel does after like 12 p.m. 12 a.m. 12 a.m. Yeah.
12 a.m.
Yeah. Like I said, I sometimes just say stupid things. It's fine. It happens.
It's easy to mess those up.
Yeah. Like Virgin. Anyway.
Anywho.
Yeah, no, but I think, again, Occam's razor favors the one real event dispersing into varied traditions rather than, they all just copied each other. It's like, I feel like it's much more simpler to say it's a shared tradition than, even if you want to say a tradition isn't true, it's much more likely to be a shared tradition than, they all just copied or it was influences from other cultures. That it's too complex. Like it just doesn't fit. Let's see what else. There are some academics that suggest that Mesopotamian mythology being the original source is overly simplistic as well. For example, Kenneth Kitchen, who wrote Ancient Orient and Old Testament, I have a quote from him here. A series of basic general similarities suggest a definite relationship between the two traditions, but there are also many detailed differences. Form of ark, duration of flood, the birds, and the Hebrew version is again simpler and less evolved. This is me interjecting into the quote. This is, I think, referring to Gilgamesh specifically versus the flood account. The Hebrew and Babylonian accounts may go back to a common ancient tradition, but are not borrowed directly from each other. And this guy is an Assyriologist. So
that sounds well-rounded.
Yes, and that's pretty much exactly the conclusion I've come to looking at all of this, rather than like the Christine Hayes or Stephanie Dawley conclusions, which, as much as I respect Stephanie Dawley's work, and I'm sure Christine Hayes has done good work, in certain aspects, that this was a little disappointing when I dug into it, that these were defined as certain parallels.
That quote relates to what I said earlier about you have to acknowledge the other side of the debate. So he acknowledged that there were some similarities, but he also said the differences as well.
Yeah, and I definitely acknowledge the similarities as well. I'm not going to say that there aren't. I just think that when we really dig into those similarities, they're not similarities, they're coincidences.
Wow.
As I've outlined.
I don't believe in coincidences, but...
Well, we just outlined with this whole tehom and everything. These are very much pure coincidences that are stretches. It's but anyway.
It's a stretch. Yeah.
Okay, so we would just define it differently. Okay, I got you.
Yes.
I got you. Okay. But yeah, so let's do another quick pause, and then we will do summary recap, and I will hit one quick thing in the closeout after summaries, and then I will cap it at that, and then we will close out the episode. So stay tuned, and we will kind of tie all this up into a neat bow for you here on Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix, because we like bows. They were a formidable weapon of the ancient times.
Or you could wear them in your hair.
Salim, we are glad that your tune has stayed here on Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix. We were just talking off air about how Maddie is writing down quotes and things that I say to use for future reference, potentially on future merchandise.
Well, both of us.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if you have any interesting quotes that we say a lot on the show that you think are funny or entertaining, email them to us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com. It might end up on merch in the future for a potential future merch store, because I have not done that yet. But yes, so
I don't know. I'd like to wear a t-shirt that says you're educated in your wrongness.
yes, it would be very funny. So summary recap time. Similarities do exist between these texts, but they don't prove dependency. Again, sometimes they're just coincidences, or as you would define them, stretches.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily telling us that one copied the other.
Mm-hmm.
The Tel Alamana texts challenge the ideas that myths traveled in a one-way copy-paste manner. Why would you do the extra work to rewrite from scratch with key themes? And so the fact that these traveled around, at least to Egypt, but these stories are so distinct, speaks more to an myth than a copycatting, I think. Yeah, and then again, we have to keep in mind the historiography of all of this, to look at what was found where, and we can't
and
make
when.
and we can't make assumptions be fact.
Mm-hmm.
And respectfully, but shame on any academic that does that, because we cannot say for certain certain claims that we've already outlined in this episode.
With all due respect, which is none.
Oh my gosh, that's another good one. But people still deserve respect, even if they're wrong.
Yes, there's different types of respect, but yes, you're right.
I'm not gonna respect authority in terms of expertise for someone that demonstrates they don't have an expertise in the area, but I will show them common respect as a human being. There is a difference, but yes. Overall, we've outlined that Genesis doesn't really borrow myth; it confronts the myths of its day. And to say that it's borrowing myth, it really just it's an oversimplification of it. Let's see what else. My summary is a bunch of jarbled
I thought
notes.
you said we were going to skip the summary.
No, we're going to skip the musings at the end. We're not going to skip the summary. Otherwise,
gotcha.
user 1, 2, 3 will get mad at us.
He's probably already mad at us,
Yeah,
to be honest.
He's not listening an hour and a half in. But yeah, no, I think the myth borrowing theories, it ignores radical theological divergence and is cherry picking the facts. Flood myths aren't as similar as skeptics like to claim either, which then again begs the original question: with the more scientific leaning descriptions we see in Genesis, did Genesis preserve an original, or at least maybe a closer original to an event? And I think that we have to analyze more than just word echoes when we're analyzing these myths. We can't just look at things like tehom and Tiamat and, make all of these stretches in terms of academic arguments. We have to consider the diffusion, what the evidence actually says, what has been found where and when. We can't just look at once upon a time and another story that says once upon a time and say that they copied from each other. That doesn't track.
I'm kind of surprised by that one.
Yeah, I know. And again, her argument wasn't so much that they were to blatantly say it, but it was more hinted at. So I want to be careful not to misrepresent her.
Yes, but even to hint it.
Yeah.
It's a little
to present it as a parallel is even a stretch.
Yeah.
But all of those were stretches. It's academic yoga there at Yale. That's what they're doing. At least in that department. But yeah, so next episode, we're going to be talking a little bit of apologetics. We're going to be diving into the more of a biblical perspective on what hell is. And I'm going to have my pastor on to talk about that one so that I can make sure I don't repeat some obscure 3rd century heresy and he can correct me on. We have a possible explorations report soon. We have a potential trip in the near future that we're going to try to do to talk about some stuff relating to Mesopotamia.
Are we going to mention what that trip is?
No. Okay. I don't want to build up false hopes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Stay tuned.
Then a possible philosophy episode on Mesopotamian philosophy. I'm struggling to wrap my head around what all is there that's worth going over, so it may happen, it may not happen. But yeah, one thing I did want to mention, the only thing I'm going to mention in the musing section before we do our closeouts here, is apparently there is theories of remnants of a culture before the Sumerians. And we actually, have you ever seen the statues of like the lizard people and stuff? Yeah, apparently that was found buried deep in Mesopotamian temples, and it predates like the written time period of like Sumerian cuneiform.
Lizard people.
The culture I'm talking about is the Ubaid culture, Ubaid, and there does seem to be some linguistic evidence for this as well, because again, going through learning some cuneiform, this is what John Hayes outlines, is he points out that there's some of these deities' names like Inanna and Namu, and I think there was another one, but there's a couple of them that don't match the phonetic way, and this is his point to make, not mine, that they don't match the phonetic way that they should, and that they're written differently than you would expect them to be. But we know their pronunciation because of Akkadian transliterations, a later language that gave us our pronunciations for cuneiform, Sumerian cuneiform. So he doesn't go as far to say that it is for sure a remnant of an older culture, but I would go that far to say it's very likely to be a remnant of an older culture, that the Sumerians are preserving the names of these deities in ways that don't quite match their language. And so they rename some of their deities to fit their language style. Like Enki very much reads as it should in Sumerian cuneiform, but like Inanna doesn't. And it's interesting. So you've got to ask a lot of questions of what's at the root of all of that there. So scrolling down past 2 pages of other follow-ups I was wanting to do.
2 pages?
Yeah, about. Do you have anything else that you're wanting to interject here?
Just research.
Yes, do some research.
Research. And then when you think you've done enough, do more.
Yeah, there will be sources in the show notes, and the Discord server will also be in the show notes, the invite, if I can figure that out, which I hope I can.
Heck yeah.
Join the Discord. We will take podcast episode suggestions, feedback on episodes as well, so you don't have to just email us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com. You could join the Discord server and talk to us, but emailing still is going to get our attention more than the Discord message. So we ask that you take some time. If you're getting some value out of this, please share the podcast with someone that you know. If you know someone that might be interested in these type of topics and to challenge the academic framework and other assumptions in the standard model in a new, fresh way, share the podcast. They might benefit from this, and we would definitely enjoy having some more support and listeners. Consider the Buy Us a Cup of Coffee book link also in the show notes if you want to support the show. $25 donation or more gets you mentioned as a producer on the subsequent show once I see it. Instagram, TikTok, m.quad.musings, YouTube, m.quad.musings, Facebook, Musings on Mysteries, the Mythical Matrix. So Send us your confessions, concessions, contentions, your snide remarks, whatever you like about the show, whatever you don't like about the show, to m.quad.musings@gmail.com. So whether you've been listening on the earth with the mortals, in the stars of heaven with Enoch and the cherubim,
or down in Sheol,
we thank you for quantumly transcending time to join us for this epic mythology, more academic discovery, I would say.
Yes.
And we hope you have a good rest of your night.
Bye.